McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819. Following the ratification of the Constitution, our young republic faced serious financial problems. To address these problems, in 1790, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, proposed the creation of a national bank. This bank would have branches throughout the United States, which could establish credit, accept deposits, and loan money to the new national government. Study Guide. Did the Constitution give Congress the enumerated power to incorporate the national bank? Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution explains that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. In other words, if a power is not enumerated somewhere in the Constitution, then Congress does not have it. Most of Congress's enumerated powers can be found in Article 1, Section 8, which lists 17 separate clauses. The power to incorporate a bank cannot be found in the first 16 clauses of Article 1, Section 8. The bill to establish the bank does not directly collect taxes, so that power is out. Nor does the bill borrow money or regulate commerce. All of the other express powers are likewise out. Only Clause 17, the necessary and proper clause, could possibly support the incorporation of the bank. The debate in Congress and in the executive branch centered around an important question. In order to execute the powers to collect taxes, borrow money, or regulate commerce, is it necessary and proper for Congress to charter a bank? Unlike the Federal Reserve Bank that exists today, the stock in the First National Bank would be held by private investors. The bank raised populist issues concerning the propriety of granting such monopolies to favored individuals. Opponents of the bank feared creation of a privileged, moneyed aristocracy of the type that existed in Europe. These factors created a white-hot political debate, and the power to grant a monopoly became the focus of the debate over the bank's constitutionality. In a speech to Congress, Representative James Madison argued that because the power to incorporate a bank was not incident to any of the enumerated powers, it was a great power that needed to be listed among the list of powers that were enumerated in the text. In addition, Madison contended that it was not necessary to incorporate a bank in order to collect taxes, borrow money, or regulate commerce. Therefore, he said, Congress lacked the power to incorporate the bank. After Congress approved the bank, President Washington asked members of his cabinet for their opinions on its constitutionality. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, took an even more stringent view of necessary than did Madison. Jefferson contended that, quote, when the Constitution restrained Congress to the necessary means of executing its powers, this was limited to, quote, those means without which the grant of the power would be nugatory. Because its goals could be accomplished in other ways, it was not necessary to charter the bank. Alexander Hamilton, who first proposed the idea of the national bank, strongly rejected Jefferson's strict reading of necessary. Instead, he defined necessary as, quote, needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive. In other words, if it is useful for Congress to charter a bank in order to collect taxes or borrow money, then Congress has the power to do so. But while Hamilton rejected any test of constitutionality that rested on the degree in which a measure is necessary, or the more or less necessity or utility of a measure, he did not go so far as to say that Congress had the discretion to adopt any means that in its sole judgment would be convenient. Instead, he offered the following test. Quote, the relation between the measure and the end, between the nature of the mean employed toward the execution of a power, and the object of that power must be the criterion of constitutionality. Today, we would call this means and scrutiny. President Washington either agreed with Hamilton's opinion on constitutionality, or he agreed with Jefferson that because the decision was a close one, he should defer to Congress. Because in 1791, he signed the bill into law chartering the first bank of the United States. It would remain in business for 2 decades. In 1816, Congress chartered a second bank of the United States. That the bill was signed into law by President James Madison has given rise to the question, of whether he had changed his mind about the meaning of the necessary and proper clause from what he had articulated as a congressman. In private correspondence, Madison defended the consistency of his approach by contending it was proper of him to defer to the judgment of several Congresses on the question of whether the bank was truly necessary to execute its powers, especially given what he said was the bank's almost necessity. But the bank soon became very unpopular. In 1818, the Maryland General Assembly imposed a tax on the branch of the Bank of the United States in Baltimore. The bank's cashier, James William McCulloch, refused to pay the tax. Maryland sued McCulloch to recover the money. The Maryland Court of Appeals ruled for the state. McCulloch then appealed the case to the Supreme Court, arguing that the state could not tax the federal institution. However, before the court could decide if the state tax was constitutional, it had to first decide if Congress had the power to charter the federal bank in the first place. The debate 2 decades earlier between Jefferson and Madison on one side and Hamilton on the other would now be resolved by the Supreme Court in McCulloch v. Maryland. Chief Justice Marshall, writing for the court, rejected Maryland's very narrow reading of necessary. Though Marshall did not cite Hamilton, the Chief Justice copied several portions of the Treasury Secretary's opinion in the bank almost verbatim. Hamilton defined necessary as needful, requisite, useful, and conducive. Marshall used the same 4 adjectives but added the word convenient at several junctures in his opinion, a term that Hamilton did not use as a synonym for necessary. That is, Marshall can be read as saying that Congress would do whatever is convenient in order to execute its other enumerated powers. Indeed, Marshall described the creation of a bank as a, quote, convenient, a useful, and essential instrument in the prosecution of its fiscal operations, and, quote, an appropriate mode of executing the powers of government. He rejected the notion that it must be an absolutely physically necessity. Marshall put forward the following test, which to this day is relied upon by the Supreme Court to determine the scope of Congress's implied powers. Quote, let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. Arguably, the criterion of means which are plainly adopted to the ends includes the sort of means and scrutiny that has been advocated by Hamilton, but this is not entirely clear. Study guide. Does Marshall's interpretation amount to a blank check to Congress? If not, what are the limits of Congress's powers under the necessary and proper clause? But the bottom line is that the court of McCulloch held that the necessary and proper clause give Congress a power sufficient to incorporate the bank. As a result, Maryland cannot tax the federal bank because, quote, the power to tax involves the power to destroy. Marshall rejected the objection that the Constitution did not specify power to create a bank on the ground that such specificity would, quote, partake of the prolixity of a legal code. Instead, he declared, we must never forget that it is a Constitution we are expounding, adding, our Constitution is intended to endure for ages to come and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. In other words, to avoid soon growing outdated, the Constitution speaks in more general terms. Marshall's opinion of McCulloch became so controversial that he defended it in the editorial pages of 2 Virginia newspapers in a series of pseudonymous columns. To rebut the charge that the court had read the necessary and proper clause to authorize an unlimited power of Congress to adopt any means whatever, Marshall highlighted a portion of his opinion that does not always receive attention. The court would have to invalidate a law should Congress, under the pretext of executing its powers, pass laws for the accomplishment of objects not entrusted to the government. Study guide. How would the court identify when Congress was acting pretextually and not asserting an enumerated power in good faith? 13 years later, in 1832, President Andrew Jackson vetoed the renewal of the National Bank because, unlike Marshall, Jackson found the bank was not necessary to the execution of Congress's enumerated powers and was therefore unconstitutional.